Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that feels impossibly distant, yet it existed just a handful of generations ago. We're not here to romanticize the past or paint it with soft brushstrokes of nostalgia. We're here to examine what it truly meant to be a child in Victorian times, when the very practices considered normal parenting would land you in court today, stripped of your children and facing criminal charges. If these glimpses into history help you drift off to sleep, you can like and subscribe, but only if you find them genuinely soothing. And if you'd like to support our channel as we explore these forgotten corners of the past, your help means more than you know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is where you are, and whether these stories from another era bring you peace. There's something oddly comforting about knowing we share this quiet journey through history together. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin with a simple truth. Childhood in Victorian times was a gauntlet of survival, and the adults running that gauntlet had methods that would horrify us today. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901 during Queen Victoria's reign, witnessed an extraordinary transformation in British society. Industrialization reshaped the landscape. Cities swelled with workers. Factories belched smoke into gray skies. And amid all this change, children occupied a peculiar position, caught between old traditions and emerging modern sensibilities. They were not quite seen as the precious, protected beings we consider them today. Instead, they were viewed through a lens that seems almost alien to our contemporary understanding. They were small adults in training, vessels to be filled with discipline and duty, resources to be utilized for family survival. The notion that childhood itself was a distinct and valuable phase of life, deserving of protection and nurturing, had not yet fully crystallized in the collective consciousness. Oh, there were stirrings of such ideas, particularly among reformers and certain segments of the middle class, but they had not yet become the default setting for society at large. Victorian parents operated under a fundamentally different philosophy from what we practice today. The prevailing wisdom held that children were born with inherent wickedness, original sin coursing through their small veins, and it was the solemn duty of parents to beat that wickedness out of them, literally. The rod was not just accepted, but actively encouraged. Spare the rod and spoil the child was not merely a saying, but a prescription, a medical advice almost, for raising a morally upright human being. The idea that a child might simply need love, patience, and gentle guidance was considered dangerously permissive, likely to produce a generation of layabouts and moral degenerates. Harshness was virtue, strictness was love, and anything resembling what we'd call nurturing was viewed with deep suspicion, as if kindness itself might contaminate the child's developing character. The class distinctions of Victorian society created wildly different childhoods within the same country, sometimes within the same city. A wealthy child might grow up in a grand house, rarely seeing their parents, raised instead by a succession of nurses and governesses, who maintained strict emotional distance. These children had food, warmth, and education, but they also had loneliness, rigid expectations, and the constant pressure to maintain family status. Meanwhile, a working-class child might be sharing a single room with 8 siblings, sleeping 3 to a bed, working in a factory by age 5, and going to bed hungry more nights than not. Both experiences, though vastly different in material terms, shared certain commonalities. Both groups of children faced discipline that would constitute abuse by modern standards. Both were expected to suppress their emotions and needs. Both were denied what we now recognize as fundamental rights of childhood. The rich child and the poor child were both, in their own ways, casualties of an era that had not yet learned to value children as children. Understanding this historical context is essential before we dive into the specific practices that would land Victorian parents in prison today. We must resist the temptation to simply judge these people as monsters. They were products of their time, operating within belief systems and economic realities that shaped their choices. But we must also unflinchingly examine what they did, because in that examination lies a deeper appreciation for how far we've come, and perhaps a warning about how easily we might slide backward if we're not vigilant. The practices we're about to explore were not fringe behaviors. They were mainstream, accepted, often recommended by authorities. Doctors prescribed them. Priests blessed them. The law permitted them. And when we look at these practices now, with our modern understanding of child development, psychology, and human rights, we see them for what they truly were: systematic abuse dressed up as proper parenting. So let's begin our journey through Victorian childhood, starting with the most visible and visceral aspect of that experience: the physical discipline that awaited children at nearly every turn. Let's talk about the beatings, the punishments, the casual violence that permeated every level of Victorian society, from the grandest manor house to the most squalid tenement. Physical punishment and the culture of correction. The Victorian approach to discipline rested on a foundation of physical pain. This was not occasional. This was not a last resort. This was daily methodology, a toolkit of violence deployed with the regularity of meals. Parents, teachers, employers, essentially any adult with authority over a child, had both the legal right and the social expectation to inflict corporal punishment. The law explicitly permitted it. Public opinion demanded it. And the child who escaped his childhood without regular beatings was the exception, not the rule. Let's start in the home, because that's where a child's education in pain began earliest. Victorian parents across the class spectrum believed that physical punishment was essential for moral development. The reasoning went something like this: children are born sinful, prone to lying, stealing, disobedience, and general wickedness. The only way to drive out this innate badness is through pain. Pain teaches. Pain corrects. Pain transforms the wicked child into the righteous adult. It was a theology of suffering applied to the nursery. The implements of discipline varied by household, but they shared a common purpose: The cane, thin and flexible, often made from birchwood, was perhaps the most ubiquitous tool. It could be wielded with precision, leaving welts that stung for days without causing the kind of visible damage that might raise questions even in that lenient era. The leather strap was another favorite, particularly for boys. It was thicker than the cane, delivered a more solid impact, and was particularly effective at conveying the full weight of adult disapproval. Wooden paddles, switches cut fresh from trees, even ordinary household objects like wooden spoons or slippers, all found their way into the disciplinary arsenal. In some households, the implement hung on the wall, a constant visual reminder of what awaited transgression. In others, it was kept in a particular drawer, and the ritual of retrieving it became part of the punishment itself, the waiting and knowing, adding psychological torment to the physical pain to come. The reasons for these beatings were often trivial by our standards. A child might be caned for speaking without being spoken to, for failing to bow deeply enough when an adult entered the room, for laughing too loudly, for crying, for looking sullen, for any expression that suggested less than complete submission to adult authority. One Victorian advice manual suggested that children should be struck for asking why too often, as excessive curiosity was a sign of disrespect. Another recommended beatings for any child who showed fear, on the theory that fear was weakness, and weakness must be driven out through pain. The logic was circular and inescapable. If you're beaten and you cry, you're beaten for crying. If you're beaten and you don't cry, you're beaten harder until you break. The child could not win. The system was designed to ensure submission, not justice. The severity of these punishments would shock modern sensibilities. Court records from the Victorian era contain cases that made it to trial only because the child died or was permanently maimed. In 1893, a schoolmaster named George Stace appeared in court for beating an 11-year-old boy named Oswald Claude Baker. The boy had skipped school to watch a funeral. The next day, Stace thrashed him with a stick, leaving bruises measuring 3 inches by 2.5 inches on one leg, with multiple marks on the other leg from repeated blows to the same spot. The boy's fingers were swollen from being struck. When the case went to court, other students testified. The vicar appeared as a character witness for the schoolmaster, praising his moderate discipline, and the court dismissed the case, ruling that the boy deserved punishment and had not been punished excessively. This was the standard. A child beaten until he bore bruises the size of playing cards was considered properly disciplined, not abused. Even more disturbing were the punishments that never made it to court because they were so completely normalized. Historical accounts describe parents holding children's hands over open flames to teach them about the dangers of fire. Think about that for a moment. Actually causing a burn to prevent future burns. The logic was considered sound. How else would a child truly learn? Words were insufficient. Fear alone was not enough. Only the searing experience of actual pain could imprint the lesson permanently. Similarly, some parents would nick their children with knives to teach them respect for sharp objects. These were not fringe practices performed by sadists in dark corners. These were recommended techniques, discussed openly, sometimes even written about in parenting guides as examples of thorough education. The schools, of course, had their own elaborate systems of corporal punishment. The cane was standard equipment in Victorian classrooms, and teachers used it liberally. Boys were typically caned on their backsides, often being bent over a desk or made to lie across a bench while the teacher delivered a prescribed number of strokes. The count mattered. 3 strokes for a minor infraction, 6 for something more serious, 12 or more for grave offenses. The strokes were delivered with enough force to leave marks that lasted days. Girls were more often caned on their legs or hands, though the principle remained the same. Pain was education. But the cane was just the beginning. Victorian schools employed a variety of punishments designed to inflict discomfort and humiliation. The dunce cap, that tall conical hat, was placed on the heads of children deemed slow or stupid, and they were made to stand in the corner, sometimes for hours, while the rest of the class continued their lessons. The message was clear: you are inferior, you are foolish, and everyone should see your shame. Some schools used punishment baskets, wicker contraptions suspended from the ceiling by ropes and pulleys. A misbehaving child would be placed inside the basket and hoisted into the air, dangling above the classroom, sometimes for the entire school day. The physical discomfort was considerable, the cramped position causing muscle aches and circulation problems. But worse was the psychological torment of being displayed like an exotic bird, an object of ridicule for hours on end. Left-handed children faced particular persecution. Being left-handed was viewed as a defect, possibly even a sign of moral corruption or satanic influence. Teachers would tie a left-handed child's left hand behind their back or strike it repeatedly whenever they attempted to use it, forcing them to learn to write with their right hand. The neurological damage this could cause, the frustration and confusion of being forced to work against one's natural inclinations was not considered. Conformity mattered more than comfort. The right way was the right way, and any deviation must be literally beaten out. Then there was the practice of lines, a punishment that sounds mild until you understand its application. A child might be assigned to write a particular sentence 500 times or 1,000 times without making a single mistake. Any error meant starting over from the beginning. Children would spend entire nights completing these assignments, their hands cramping, their eyes straining in candlelight, driven by the knowledge that failure to complete the task meant a beating the next morning. The punishment was designed to be almost impossible to complete perfectly, ensuring that most children would face physical consequences anyway. It was a trap disguised as mercy. Religious institutions added their own flavor to disciplinary practices. Sunday schools and religious academies often employed even harsher measures than secular schools, justified by the need to save children's immortal souls. One particularly harrowing practice involved locking disobedient children in small, dark spaces for extended periods. A child might be shut in a closet, a cupboard, even a cellar for hours or days, with minimal food and water, as punishment for infractions as minor as fidgeting during prayers. The psychological trauma of such isolation, particularly for young children, was not considered. Or rather, it was considered and deemed beneficial. Fear of darkness, fear of confinement, fear of abandonment, all were tools in the toolkit of moral education. The literature of the time is revealing. Consider The History of the Fairchild Family, a wildly popular children's book published in 1818 and still widely read throughout the Victorian era. In one scene, young Henry Fairchild tells a lie. His father's response is to lock him in an isolated room where he cannot speak to anyone. And when the child weeps, Mr. Fairchild explains, "It is better that he should be punished in this world, whilst he is a little boy, than grow up to be a liar and thief, and go to hell when he dies. For it is written, Every liar shall have his portion in the lake which burneth with fire and brimstone." This was not presented as extreme parenting. This was model behavior, an example for other parents to follow. The threat of eternal damnation was constantly invoked to justify temporal cruelty. Even the most enlightened Victorian parents, those who prided themselves on being less harsh than their peers, practiced discipline that would constitute criminal abuse today. They might not beat their children daily, but they employed psychological punishments that were equally damaging. Children might be made to stand silent and motionless for hours. They might be deprived of meals as punishment, sent to bed hungry, not because there was no food, but because they had transgressed. They might be denied any positive interaction with parents or siblings for days at a time, effectively being shunned within their own homes. The message was constant. Your needs do not matter. Your feelings do not matter. Your pain is deserved. And here's the truly chilling part. This was considered loving. Parents who beat their children believed they were doing right by them, preparing them for a harsh world, teaching them the discipline they would need to succeed. When asked to justify their methods, Victorian parents would often become indignant, insisting that failure to use corporal punishment was itself a form of neglect, a dereliction of parental duty. To spare the rod was to doom the child. In their minds, the parent who beat a child regularly was the good parent, the responsible parent, the one who truly cared about the child's future. The modern parent who would never dream of striking a child would have been viewed as dangerously permissive, practically guaranteeing that the child would grow up to be a criminal or a wastrel. It's worth noting that even when cases of extreme abuse did make it to the attention of authorities, prosecution was rare and conviction even rarer. Teachers who beat children to death were sometimes convicted only of manslaughter and received shockingly light sentences. Parents who permanently injured their children might face criticism from neighbors, but rarely legal consequences. The one case I mentioned earlier, where the teacher Hopley flogged a child named Reginald Chancellor to death, was notable precisely because it was one of the few times a teacher was actually sentenced for such an act. And even then, his defense was that he was simply following accepted religious principles about discipline, and many in society sympathized with him. The lasting damage of this culture of violence is difficult to fully calculate. We know from modern psychology that children who experience regular physical punishment are more likely to develop anxiety, depression, aggression, and a host of other psychological issues. We know that corporal punishment damages the parent-child bond, teaches children that might makes right, and normalizes violence as a problem-solving strategy. Victorian children grew up in a world where the people who were supposed to love and protect them were also the people most likely to hurt them, and where that hurt was framed as care. The psychological scars must have been profound, though the Victorian era had no language for such things and no real interest in exploring the inner lives of children. Today, physical punishment of children is illegal in 65 countries and counting. In these places, even a single slap can result in criminal charges, loss of custody, and social services intervention. The idea that you would cane a child until they bled, lock them in closets for days, or burn their hands to teach them lessons would result in immediate arrest and likely years in prison. The Victorian parent transplanted to our time would be viewed not as a strict disciplinarian, but as a violent criminal. And that transformation in social understanding, that recognition that children have a right to physical safety even from their own parents, represents one of the most profound moral advances of the modern era. We no longer accept the premise that beating children makes them better people. We understand that it traumatizes them, that it teaches them to fear rather than respect, and that there are infinitely more effective ways to guide children toward good behavior. The Victorian would call us soft. We would call them abusers. And by any objective measure of child welfare, we would be right. Child labor and the economics of exploitation. If the culture of physical punishment was the skeleton of Victorian childhood, child labor was the flesh hanging on those bones. This was not a matter of children doing age-appropriate chores or learning trades through gentle apprenticeship. This was systematic exploitation on a scale that defined the era, with children as young as 4 years old working in conditions that would kill many of them before they reached adulthood. Child labor in Victorian England was ubiquitous, brutal, and entirely legal. In fact, it was considered necessary both for the functioning of the economy and for the moral development of the children themselves. Let's begin with the most horrifying example: the mines. Deep beneath the Earth's surface, in narrow tunnels barely tall enough for a child to crawl through, boys and girls worked in darkness pierced only by the flickering light of dangerous lamps. They were there because of their size. The coal seams were often too low for adult workers to navigate, so children were sent in, tasked with jobs that would seem impossible to assign to anyone, let alone someone not yet in their teens. The youngest children worked as trappers. Imagine being 5 years old and spending 12 to 18 hours each day sitting alone in complete darkness in a small hole carved into the mine wall. Your job is to hold a string attached to a heavy wooden door. When you hear the coal wagons approaching, you pull the string to open the door. Hold it open as the wagon passes, then close it again. You do this hundreds of times a day. You are alone. You are in darkness. The mine is cold and damp. Rats scurry past your feet. The sound of the mine creaks and groans around you, and every sound might be the warning before a collapse. You are 5 years old, and this is your job. Older children, perhaps 7 or 8, graduated to being hurriers or pushers. They were harnessed to carts laden with coal, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, and they pulled or pushed these carts through the tunnels on their hands and knees. The harness cut into their small bodies. The tunnels were so low that they couldn't stand upright, so they moved in a perpetual crouch or crawl, their backs bent at angles that would cause permanent spinal damage. Their hands and knees were constantly scraped raw against the rough tunnel floors. Many wore no clothes or only minimal garments because of the heat and humidity in the deeper shafts. And contemporary reports described seeing these children, blackened with coal dust, bleeding from dozens of small cuts, looking less like humans and more like some kind of subterranean creatures. The air in the mines was poison. Proper ventilation was minimal or non-existent. The children breathed in coal dust with every breath, the fine particles settling in their lungs, causing respiratory diseases that would eventually kill many of them. Black lung was not a rare occupational hazard. It was the expected outcome of mine work. If you worked in the mines as a child, you simply accepted that you probably wouldn't live to see 25. And if you did, you'd spend those years coughing up black phlegm and struggling to breathe. Death was a constant companion. Cave-ins buried children alive. Gas explosions turned entire sections of mines into infernos. Flooded shafts drowned workers. Machinery malfunctions crushed small bodies. The Durham Mining Museum has compiled lists of mining disasters from the Victorian era, and reading through them is a journey through horror. Entry after entry documents the deaths of children, some as young as 5. Thomas Smith, aged 7, crushed by a fall of coal. Mary Ann Jones, aged 9, drowned in flooded shaft. Robert Williams, aged 6, killed in explosion. These were not rare tragedies. These were Tuesday afternoons. And here's what makes this even more grotesque. The children were paid almost nothing. A typical child miner might earn the equivalent of a few dollars per week in today's money, a fraction of what an adult would receive for the same work. Families were so desperate that they needed this pittance. The alternative to having your children work was often starvation. So parents sent their babies into the darkness, knowing the dangers, hating the necessity, but seeing no other choice. The economic system had structured itself to require child sacrifice. Factory work was only marginally less dangerous and no less exploitative. The Industrial Revolution had created a voracious appetite for labor, and children could be paid less, controlled more easily, and forced into spaces and positions that adult workers couldn't manage. In textile mills, the youngest children worked as scavengers, which sounds almost quaint until you learn what it actually meant. Scavengers had to crawl underneath the massive, moving textile machinery to collect loose cotton, thread, and debris while the machines were still running. The machines did not stop. The child crawled beneath them, inches from gears and belts and mechanical parts that could grab a hand, an arm, a head, and pull the child into the machinery before anyone could react. Many children were scalped when their hair got caught in the machines. Many lost fingers or entire hands. Many were crushed. The factory owners knew this was happening. They saw the accidents, they cleaned up the blood, and they kept sending children under the machines because it was profitable and legal. When a child was killed or maimed, another child was hired to replace them, often from the same family, because the family now needed to replace the lost income. Older children worked as picers, standing beside the spinning machines for 12 to 16 hours at a stretch, repairing broken threads. The work required intense concentration and quick reflexes. The room was hot, poorly ventilated, and filled with cotton dust that caused respiratory problems similar to those experienced by miners. The noise was deafening, a constant roar of machinery that left many factory children partially deaf by their teenage years. And if a child fell asleep on their feet, which happened regularly given the exhausting hours, they might fall forward into the machine or be beaten by the foreman who patrolled the factory floor with a strap. The Factory Acts passed throughout the 19th century represent some of the first attempts to regulate child labor, and reading them now reveals just how extreme the situation was. The 1819 Cotton Mills Act prohibited children under 9 from working in cotton mills, and limited children aged 9 to 16 to a maximum of 12 hours per day. Notice what that means. Before this act, there was no minimum age at all, and children could work unlimited hours. This act, considered progressive at the time, still allowed a 9-year-old to work a 12-hour shift. That was the reform. That was progress. And even these minimal protections were rarely enforced. There were only 4 factory inspectors for the entire country, responsible for thousands of mills. Children continued to work in violation of the act, and owners knew they would almost certainly never be caught. Later acts made incremental improvements. The 1833 Factory Act banned children under 9 from textile factories and limited children 9 to 13 to 9 hours a day. The 1842 Mines Act finally prohibited children under 10 and all women from working underground in coal mines. But these laws were patchwork, applying only to specific industries, and they left huge swaths of child labor completely unregulated. Children still worked in match factories, where they dipped matches in white phosphorus, a substance that caused phossy jaw, a horrific condition where the jawbone literally rotted away. Children worked in brick kilns, in glassworks, in shipyards, in nail factories. They worked in agriculture, often in gangs, moving from farm to farm, living in barns, working dawn to dusk for pennies. Then there were the street trades, the children who weren't even fortunate enough to have factory work. These were the chimney sweeps, the crossing sweepers, the match sellers, the flower girls. Chimney sweeps were perhaps the most emblematic of Victorian child exploitation. Small boys, often as young as 4 or 5, were purchased from workhouses or desperate parents and sent up the narrow chimneys of Victorian homes to clean them. The child climbed inside the chimney, scraping at the soot and creosote buildup with brushes and their own hands and knees, working their way up the narrow flue in complete darkness, breathing toxic fumes, their skin scraped raw by the brick. Many got stuck and suffocated. Many fell to their deaths. Many developed testicular cancer from the constant contact with carcinogenic soot, a condition so common among chimney sweeps that it became known as chimney sweep cancer. The master sweeps, the adults who owned these children, would sometimes light small fires at the base of the chimney to encourage a reluctant child to climb, literally burning them from below to force them upward. When a boy became too large to fit in the chimneys, usually around age 12 or 13, he was often cast out with no skills, no education, and a body already ravaged by years of abuse. Many turned to crime. Many died in the streets. A 12-year-old sweep named George Brewster died in 1875 after his master forced him to clean a hospital chimney. He became stuck and suffocated. The public outcry over this particular death finally led to the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, which required sweeps to be licensed. Note the date, 1875. This most obviously barbaric practice continued well into the latter part of the Victorian era before even minimal regulation was imposed. Crossing sweepers were children who stood at busy intersections with brooms, sweeping a path through the mud and horse manure that covered Victorian streets, hoping that pedestrians would toss them a penny or two. These children worked in all weather, rain, snow, sleet, often without adequate clothing, their feet wrapped in rags, standing for hours in filth for the chance of earning enough to buy a crust of bread. Match sellers and flower girls, made famous by works like My Fair Lady, were similarly desperate, hawking their cheap wares in the streets, vulnerable to abuse, exposure, disease, and the constant threat of starvation. The economic logic that supported all this exploitation was simple. Children were cheaper than adults, more controllable, and often more suited to certain tasks because of their small size. Factory owners, mine operators, and other employers calculated that the small investment in child labor produced acceptable returns even when factoring in the occasional death or injury. Children were, in the cold calculus of Victorian capitalism, resources to be used up and replaced as needed. And because the children came overwhelmingly from poor families, their deaths and suffering did not trouble the social conscience the way the suffering of middle or upper-class children would have. The psychological impact of this system was profound. Children who worked 14-hour days in factories from the age of 5 never attended school, never learned to read, never developed social skills beyond submission to authority. They were stunted physically, their bodies bent and broken by labor they should never have performed. They were stunted intellectually, denied any chance at education or mental development, and they were stunted emotionally, living lives of such constant hardship that tenderness, play, and joy were almost entirely absent from their experience. Today, child labor laws in developed countries are strict and comprehensive. In the United States, children under 14 generally cannot be employed at all, except in very limited circumstances, like family businesses or entertainment. Children 14 and 15 can work only certain jobs during certain hours, with limits designed to ensure school attendance and adequate rest. Hazardous occupations are completely off limits to anyone under 18. Violations result in serious fines and potential criminal charges. The idea that you could hire a 5-year-old to work a 12-hour shift in a factory, let alone send them into a mine or up a chimney, is so far beyond the pale that it's difficult to imagine as ever having been legal. But it was legal. It was normal. It was, in fact, the foundation on which Victorian prosperity was built. The great fortunes, the grand country estates, the elaborate balls and parties, the art and literature and culture that we associate with Victorian England, all of it was financed, at least in part, by the labor of children who would never live to see 25. The Victorian parent who sent their 6-year-old to the factory before dawn and collected their meager wages at the end of the week was not considered a criminal. Today, such a parent would face immediate arrest, loss of custody, and a lengthy prison sentence. And that's exactly as it should be. Medical treatment and healthcare neglect. If physical punishment and child labor defined the external experience of Victorian childhood, the medical practices of the era shaped its internal horrors. Victorian medicine was a nightmare parade of ignorance, superstition, and substances that were often more dangerous than the conditions they purported to treat. And children, particularly infants and toddlers, bore the brunt of medical practices that today would constitute criminal negligence at best and manslaughter at worst. Let's start with the most shocking statistic. Approximately 16% of child deaths in Victorian England resulted directly from parents attempting to treat teething with opium. Think about that. Not 16% of children treated with opium died. 16% of all child deaths were caused by well-intentioned parents giving opium to their babies for teething pain. Teething, a completely normal developmental process that every human who develops teeth experiences, was treated as a potentially fatal disease in Victorian England, and the cure killed more children than the condition ever could have. The logic, such as it was, went like this. Teething caused discomfort, crying, and sometimes fever. These symptoms could be dangerous if left untreated. Opium, widely available and cheap, could quiet a crying baby and seem to reduce symptoms. Therefore, opium was the obvious solution. The fact that opium is a powerful narcotic that can easily cause fatal overdoses in infants, that it suppresses appetite causing starvation, that it's highly addictive and creates dependency even in babies, none of this stopped Victorian parents from dosing their infants regularly with opiates. The products had charming, innocent names that disguised their deadly contents. Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, Atkinson's Royal Infant's Preservative, Street's Infant's Quietness. These and dozens of other brands were marketed specifically for babies and young children. The bottles featured reassuring images of smiling infants and made extravagant claims about safety and effectiveness. The mother's friend for children teething, promised one advertisement. A mother's kiss is not half so soothing to baby as Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, claimed another, assuring parents that the syrup was absolutely harmless. It was not harmless. It contained morphine, a derivative of opium, in sufficient quantities to addict and kill infants. The scale of use was staggering. One Manchester druggist admitted to selling 5 to 6 gallons of these quietness preparations every week. That's roughly 24 to 30 pints of opiate-laced syrup going into the mouths of babies and children in a single town in a single week. Multiply that across every town and city in England, and you begin to grasp the magnitude of what was essentially mass poisoning of infants. And the deaths were horrifying. An infant given just 4 drops of laudanum, a tincture of opium in alcohol, over a 9-hour period, died of overdose. 4 drops over 9 hours. That's how little it took to kill a baby, and that's how little Victorian parents understood about appropriate dosing. The truly tragic part is that when babies died from these opiate preparations, their deaths were often attributed to teething itself rather than to the treatment. Parents who had dosed their infant with opium would find the child unresponsive, convulsing, or dead, and they would blame teething. They would genuinely believe that they hadn't given enough opium, that if they'd only used a higher dose, their baby would have survived. Doctors of the era perpetuated this misunderstanding. Medical authorities stated that 3/4 of all deaths from opium occurred in children under 5. Yet the practice continued, endorsed and recommended by the very people who should have been stopping it. But opium was far from the only dangerous substance being given to children. Victorian medicine had an alarming fondness for mercury, arsenic, and other substances we now know to be highly toxic. Calomel, a laxative made from mercury chloride, was routinely administered to children for everything from constipation to general malaise. Mercury is a neurotoxin. It causes brain damage, kidney failure, and a host of other serious health problems. But Victorian doctors prescribed it freely to children, sometimes in doses that would cause obvious mercury poisoning, the symptoms of which were then treated with more medicine. Ipecacuanha, a powdered root that induces violent vomiting, was another popular treatment for children. The Victorian medical establishment had a peculiar belief that illness resided in the stomach and needed to be expelled through vomiting or defecation. So children with colds, coughs, or fevers were given ipecacuanha to make them vomit repeatedly, a process that left them dehydrated and weakened, but which was considered therapeutic. Newborns were routinely given castor oil shortly after birth, a powerful laxative that caused cramping and diarrhea in infants whose digestive systems were barely functioning. The rationale was that the newborn needed to clear out whatever had accumulated in the womb. The result was often severe dehydration in babies who desperately needed to be gaining weight and establishing feeding routines. Teething powders, marketed as safer alternatives to liquid opiates, often contained calomel, that mercury compound again, or antimony, another toxic substance. These powders did provide some relief, but at the cost of slowly poisoning the children who used them regularly. And beyond the specific poisons, there was the broader issue of medical ignorance. Victorian doctors did not understand germ theory for much of the era. They did not know that hand-washing between patients could prevent disease spread. They did not understand the importance of sterilizing surgical instruments. Doctors would move from performing autopsies on diseased corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands, spreading deadly infections to mothers and infants. Patent medicines were completely unregulated. Anyone could mix up a concoction, slap a label on it making wild health claims, and sell it to desperate parents. John Collis Brown's collodine, one of the most popular medicines of the era, claimed to cure everything from colds to cholera. Its ingredients? Opium, cannabis, and chloral hydrate, a powerful hypnotic. This cocktail of dangerous drugs was given to children for coughs, stomach aches, and sleeplessness. Many became addicted. Many died. The British Medical Association didn't publish Secret Remedies, an exposé of dangerous patent medicines, until 1909, near the end of the Victorian era, finally bringing some accountability to an industry that had poisoned generations. Beyond the issue of poisonous medicines, there was simple neglect driven by ignorance. Before the age of 5, 35 out of every 45 Victorian children contracted one or more of the following: smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, typhus, or enteric fever. Many did not survive. Vaccines existed for some of these diseases, but their use was not widespread. And parents who feared vaccination more than they feared the diseases themselves allowed their children to go unprotected. Sanitation was poor, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, and children played in streets fouled by sewage and industrial waste, drinking from contaminated water sources, living in conditions that bred disease. When illness struck, the treatments were often worse than the disease. A child with a fever might be bled, the medieval practice of draining blood from the body to balance the humors. Leeches were applied to children's skin, or veins were opened with lancets, all based on theories that had no scientific validity. A child with a respiratory infection might be given brandy or wine. The alcohol supposed to have medicinal properties, but in reality just adding intoxication to illness. Poultices made from bizarre ingredients, mustard, onion, various herbs, were applied to children's chests and backs, sometimes causing burns and skin irritation, but rarely providing actual relief. Newborns were routinely given castor oil shortly after birth, a powerful laxative that caused cramping and diarrhea in infants whose digestive systems were barely functioning. The rationale was that the newborn needed to clear out whatever had accumulated in the womb. The result was often severe dehydration in babies who desperately needed to be gaining weight and establishing feeding routines. Teething powders, marketed as safer alternatives to liquid opiates, often contained calomel, that mercury compound again, or antimony, another toxic substance. These powders did provide some relief, but at the cost of slowly poisoning the children who used them regularly. And beyond the specific poisons, there was the broader issue of medical ignorance. Victorian doctors did not understand germ theory for much of the era. They did not know that hand-washing between patients could prevent disease spread. They did not understand the importance of sterilizing surgical instruments. Doctors would move from performing autopsies on diseased corpses to delivering babies without washing their hands, spreading deadly infections to mothers and infants. Patent medicines were completely unregulated. Anyone could mix up a concoction, slap a label on it making wild health claims, and sell it to desperate parents. John Collis Brown's collodine, one of the most popular medicines of the era, claimed to cure everything from colds to cholera. Its ingredients? Opium, cannabis, and chloral hydrate, a powerful hypnotic. This cocktail of dangerous drugs was given to children for coughs, stomach aches, and sleeplessness. Many became addicted. Many died. The British Medical Association didn't publish Secret Remedies, an exposé of dangerous patent medicines, until 1909, near the end of the Victorian era, finally bringing some accountability to an industry that had poisoned generations. Beyond the issue of poisonous medicines, there was simple neglect driven by ignorance. Before the age of 5, 35 out of every 45 Victorian children contracted one or more of the following: smallpox, measles, scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, typhus, or enteric fever. Many did not survive. Vaccines existed for some of these diseases, but their use was not widespread, and parents who feared vaccination more than they feared the diseases themselves allowed their children to go unprotected. Sanitation was poor, particularly in working-class neighborhoods, and children played in streets fouled by sewage and industrial waste, drinking from contaminated water sources, living in conditions that bred disease. When illness struck, the treatments were often worse than the disease. A child with a fever might be bled, the medieval practice of draining blood from the body to balance the humors. Leeches were applied to children's skin, or veins were opened with lancets, all based on theories that had no scientific validity. The mortality statistics tell the story. In the late 1800s, more than 16% of children died before their first birthday. By the mid-20th century, that figure had dropped to around 3% in the UK. Today, it's approximately 0.35%. That dramatic decline is due to better sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics, and the abandonment of practices like dosing babies with opium. Every child saved represents a Victorian practice that we've learned to reject. Every baby that reaches their first birthday is a small victory over the ignorance and casual cruelty of the past. Emotional neglect and psychological abuse. Beyond the physical dangers and medical nightmares, Victorian childhood was characterized by a profound emotional coldness that would strike most modern parents as deeply disturbing. The Victorian philosophy of child-rearing emphasized emotional restraint, even between parents and children. Affection was viewed with suspicion, as something that might weaken a child's character or make them soft and unprepared for the harsh realities of life. The result was a generation of children raised with minimal physical affection, little emotional support, and constant messages that their feelings were unimportant or, worse, shameful. In wealthy households, the emotional distance was built into the structure of daily life. Victorian parents, particularly in the upper classes, saw their children once per day, if at all. The child would be brought from the nursery, cleaned and dressed by the nurse or nanny, presented to the parents for a brief visit, and then returned to the nursery. Some families institutionalized this practice with formal visiting hours, 30 minutes after breakfast or before dinner, when children were permitted to be in their parents' presence. Outside of these scheduled times, children were kept separate, raised by hired help who were themselves instructed to maintain emotional distance. The greeting between Victorian parent and child was often a handshake. Think about that. A father shaking hands with his 5-year-old daughter in the morning as if they were business associates meeting at a club. A mother extending her hand to her son rather than embracing him. This was considered proper, an appropriate level of physical contact that maintained boundaries and prevented the child from becoming clingy or overly dependent. Kisses were rare, usually reserved for special occasions or dispensed as a reward for particularly good behavior. Hugs were even rarer, seen as excessive and likely to spoil the child. The nanny occupied a strange position in this emotional landscape. She was with the children constantly, caring for their physical needs, witnessing their tears and tantrums and joys. In many cases, the nanny became the closest thing the child had to a loving parental figure. But even nannies were instructed not to be too affectionate. The ideal nanny was stern, consistent, and emotionally neutral. Love, if it existed, was to be restrained, expressed through duty rather than warmth. When economic circumstances forced families to let nannies go, children were often devastated, having lost the only adult who showed them any consistent attention, even if that attention was limited by professional expectations. The emotional messages children received were consistently invalidating. Crying was weakness and was punished. A child who cried after being hurt might be beaten for crying, the logic being that pain should be endured in silence. Fear was likewise unacceptable. The child afraid of the dark, of loud noises, of separation, was told to toughen up, stop being foolish, control themselves. There was no acknowledgement that fear is a normal human emotion, particularly for young children. Instead, fear was framed as a character flaw that must be eliminated through shame and punishment. Laughter was acceptable only in moderation and only at appropriate times. A child who laughed too loudly or at the wrong moment might be punished for lack of decorum. Spontaneous expressions of joy, the natural exuberance of childhood, were suppressed in favor of controlled, measured behavior that mimicked adult comportment. Children were expected to sit still for hours during adult gatherings, neither speaking nor showing signs of boredom or restlessness. They were ornamental, present to be seen but not heard, their actual internal experiences deemed irrelevant. The lack of emotional support extended to moments of genuine need. A child who experienced something traumatic, a nightmare, a scary event, the death of a pet, was often given no comfort or space to process their feelings. Instead, they were told not to dwell on such things, to think of something else, to be strong. The Victorian age had no concept of emotional processing or psychological trauma. Feelings were not discussed. They were simply to be controlled. This emotional neglect had a theoretical justification. Victorian child-rearing philosophy held that children were born with dangerous tendencies toward selfishness and emotional excess. Too much affection would encourage these tendencies, making the child demanding and self-centered. The proper approach was to deny the child's emotional needs systematically, teaching them through deprivation that their desires were less important than duty and propriety. By withholding affection, parents believed they were producing children who would grow into adults capable of controlling their emotions and functioning in a demanding society. The psychological damage of this approach is well documented in modern research. Children who grow up without secure emotional attachments to caregivers often develop attachment disorders, difficulty forming relationships, problems with emotional regulation, and higher rates of mental illness. The Victorian adult who appeared stoic and emotionally controlled may well have been someone suffering from untreated depression, anxiety, or trauma, unable to express or even recognize their own emotional needs because they'd been taught from infancy that such needs were shameful. Some Victorian parents took emotional control to even more extreme lengths. Children in some households were not permitted to express preferences. Asked what they wanted for dinner, the correct answer was always, "Whatever you think best." A child who expressed a desire for a particular food, toy, or activity was being demanding and needed to be corrected. The message was clear: your wants do not matter. You should not have wants, and if you express them, you will be punished. This systematic denial of agency and preference is now recognized as a form of psychological abuse. Religious instruction often amplified these emotionally abusive practices. Many Victorian families were deeply religious, and children were taught that they were sinful, that their natural inclinations were evil, and that only through constant vigilance and self-denial could they hope to avoid eternal damnation. Children as young as 3 or 4 were given sermons about hellfire, told graphic stories about the torments awaiting the wicked, and made to examine their consciences for sins they couldn't even understand. The resulting anxiety and fear were considered beneficial, keeping the child on the righteous path. One particularly cruel practice involved taking children to see public executions or to visit places where criminals were punished. Parents would point out the consequences of sin, using fear of punishment to enforce moral behavior. Some parents took their children to see corpses, either at public viewings or even taking them to graveyards specifically to contemplate death and the fate of sinners. This was not seen as traumatizing, but as educational, giving children a realistic understanding of mortality and consequence. The cumulative effect of this emotional environment was a childhood marked by loneliness, anxiety, and a profound sense of being unloved. Victorian children learned to hide their feelings, to present a controlled facade, to never ask for comfort or reassurance. They learned that the adults in their lives were not safe people to turn to with fears or sorrows. They learned that their internal experiences were irrelevant or shameful. And they carried these lessons into adulthood, perpetuating the cycle with their own children. Today, emotional neglect is recognized as a form of child abuse. Parents who systematically deny their children affection, fail to respond to their emotional needs, or create an environment where the child feels unloved, can lose custody. Therapists routinely identify childhood emotional neglect as a root cause of adult psychological problems. We understand now that children need love, affection, emotional validation, and a sense of security to develop into healthy adults. The Victorian approach of emotional withholding would today be grounds for intervention by child protective services. The contrast is stark. Where Victorian parents shook hands with their children, modern parents are encouraged to hug their kids multiple times daily. Where Victorian children were told to suppress their emotions, modern children are taught to identify and express their feelings. Where Victorian parents maintained strict emotional distance, the psychological damage of this approach is well documented in modern research. Children who grow up without secure emotional attachments to caregivers often develop attachment disorders, difficulty forming relationships, problems with emotional regulation, and higher rates of mental illness. The Victorian adult who appeared stoic and emotionally controlled may well have been someone suffering from untreated depression, anxiety, or trauma, unable to express or even recognize their own emotional needs, because they'd been taught from infancy that such needs were shameful. Some Victorian parents took emotional control to even more extreme lengths. Children in some households were not permitted to express preferences. Asked what they wanted for dinner, the correct answer was always whatever you think best. A child who expressed a desire for a particular food, toy, or activity was being demanding and needed to be corrected. The message was clear. Your wants do not matter. You should not have wants, and if you express them, you will be punished. This systematic denial of agency and preference is now recognized as a form of psychological abuse. Religious instruction often amplified these emotionally abusive practices. Many Victorian families were deeply religious, and children were taught that they were sinful, that their natural inclinations were evil, and that only through constant vigilance and self-denial could they hope to avoid eternal damnation. Children as young as 3 or 4 were given sermons about hellfire, told graphic stories about the torments awaiting the wicked, and made to examine their consciences for sins they couldn't even understand. The resulting anxiety and fear were considered beneficial, keeping the child on the righteous path. One particularly cruel practice involved taking children to see public executions or to visit places where criminals were punished. Parents would point out the consequences of sin, using fear of punishment to enforce moral behavior. Some parents took their children to see corpses, either at public viewings or even taking them to graveyards specifically to contemplate death and the fate of sinners. This was not seen as traumatizing, but as educational, giving children a realistic understanding of mortality and consequence. The cumulative effect of this emotional environment was a childhood marked by loneliness, anxiety, and a profound sense of being unloved. Victorian children learned to hide their feelings, to present a controlled facade, to never ask for comfort or reassurance. They learned that the adults in their lives were not safe people to turn to with fears or sorrows. They learned that their internal experiences were irrelevant or shameful, and they carried these lessons into adulthood, perpetuating the cycle with their own children. Today, emotional neglect is recognized as a form of child abuse. Parents who systematically deny their children affection, fail to respond to their emotional needs, or create an environment where the child feels unloved can lose custody. Therapists routinely identify childhood emotional neglect as a root cause of adult psychological problems. We understand now that children need love, affection, emotional validation, and a sense of security to develop into healthy adults. The Victorian approach of emotional withholding would today be grounds for intervention by child protective services. The contrast is stark. Where Victorian parents shook hands with their children, modern parents are encouraged to hug their kids multiple times daily. Where Victorian children were told to suppress their emotions, modern children are taught to identify and express their feelings. Where Victorian parents maintained strict emotional distance, modern parents are advised to form secure attachments. We've learned that love doesn't spoil children. Lack of love damages them. And that understanding represents a fundamental shift. The bottles themselves were often dangerous. The murder bottle, or killer bottle, was a common design in the Victorian era. A glass bottle with a long rubber tube attached. The theory was that the tube would allow the baby to feed more naturally, supposedly mimicking breastfeeding. In practice, the tubes were impossible to clean, and milk would spoil inside them, creating bacterial infections that killed infants. Despite the known dangers and the fact that these bottles earned their grim nicknames precisely because they killed so many babies, they remained in use for decades. Weaning practices were equally hazardous. Some parents believed that weaning should happen as early as a few months, transitioning infants to solid foods far before their digestive systems could handle them. Others believed in late weaning, but used bizarre and cruel methods to achieve it. One common practice was to apply bitter substances, aloe, mustard, or even pepper to the mother's nipples to make the baby reject the breast. Another method was to dose the baby with opium to suppress their appetite and crying, essentially drugging the child through the weaning process. Neither approach considered the infant's actual nutritional needs or emotional state. Weaning was something to be accomplished as efficiently as possible, regardless of the impact on the baby. Sleep practices were another area where Victorian parents' methods would constitute criminal neglect today. Infants were often given opiate-based soothing syrups to make them sleep through the night. The infant who slept for 12 or 14 hours straight was considered well-behaved, when in fact they were semi-conscious from narcotics. The danger of suffocation was high. A deeply drugged infant could not move or cry out if they became tangled in blankets or if their face was pressed against bedding. Many infants died this way, their deaths attributed to overlaying or mysterious causes, rather than to the drugs that had rendered them unable to save themselves. Sleeping arrangements varied by class but were rarely safe. Working-class infants often slept in the same bed as parents and multiple siblings, increasing the risk of accidental suffocation. Wealthier infants slept in cribs or cradles in the nursery, but these were often poorly designed, with gaps where a baby's head could become trapped or loose bedding that posed suffocation risks. The concept of back-sleeping to prevent sudden infant death syndrome wouldn't emerge until the late 20th century. Victorian babies slept in whatever position seemed convenient, with whatever blankets and pillows were available. Infant clothing and swaddling practices were restrictive and sometimes dangerous. Tight swaddling was believed to ensure the baby's limbs would grow straight, so infants were wrapped tightly, their arms bound to their sides, their legs straightened. This practice restricted movement and blood flow and made it difficult for infants to regulate their temperature. In cold weather, they might overheat under too many layers. In warm weather, they might still be swaddled because the practice was considered essential, regardless of temperature. Bathing practices ranged from excessive to neglectful. Some Victorian child-rearing manuals recommended daily cold baths for infants, believing this would toughen them up and improve their constitution. A newborn might be plunged into cold water regularly, the shock to their system considered character building. Other families rarely bathed their infants, particularly in working-class households, where water had to be hauled and heated and was in short supply. The result was poor hygiene that contributed to skin infections and disease. Vaccination was available for smallpox by the Victorian era, but its uptake was inconsistent. Some parents embraced vaccination. Others feared it more than they feared the disease, influenced by anti-vaccination movements that claimed vaccines were dangerous or ungodly. Infants who went unvaccinated were vulnerable to diseases that could easily be prevented, and many died as a result. The situation was complicated by the fact that early vaccination practices were not as safe as modern ones. Occasional infections were transmitted through contaminated vaccine material, but the risks of vaccination were infinitesimally smaller than the risks of the diseases they prevented. Infanticide, while illegal, was also not uncommon, particularly among the desperately poor. Infants whose parents could not feed them might be abandoned, left on doorsteps or in public places, hoping someone else would take them in. Many died of exposure before being found. Others were taken to baby farms, institutions that promised to care for infants for a fee. Some baby farms were legitimate, but many were essentially murder operations, taking payment from desperate mothers and then neglecting the infants until they died, keeping the clothes and belongings to resell. The most notorious baby farmer, Amelia Dyer, is believed to have murdered somewhere between 200 and 400 infants over a 20-year period in the late Victorian era. The overall infant mortality rate tells the story of just how dangerous it was to be born in Victorian England. As mentioned earlier, more than 16% of infants died before their first birthday. In poor urban areas, the rate was even higher, sometimes approaching 25 or 30%. Families expected to lose children. Parents often delayed naming infants or forming strong emotional attachments until the baby had survived the perilous first year. The death of an infant was tragic, but not shocking. It was common enough to be almost routine. Today, every aspect of infant care is regulated and informed by decades of medical research. Formula is carefully formulated and regulated to provide complete nutrition. Bottles are designed to be easily sterilized. Safe sleep campaigns have dramatically reduced infant deaths from suffocation. Breastfeeding support is widely available. Vaccinations are strongly encouraged and closely monitored. Parents who fail to provide adequate nutrition who use dangerous sleep practices, who give drugs to their infants, or who neglect basic medical care, can face criminal charges. The Victorian parent who purchased a murder bottle, dosed their baby with opium, and swaddled them so tightly they couldn't move, would be arrested today, and rightfully so. Our understanding of what infants need to survive and thrive has advanced enormously, and we no longer accept the casual infant mortality that Victorians simply shrugged off as normal. Nutrition and the politics of food. Victorian attitudes toward childhood nutrition were a strange mix of emerging nutritional science and persistent superstitions, all filtered through class divides that ensured poor children went hungry, while rich children were often deliberately deprived of foods they enjoyed. The result was a landscape of malnutrition, stunted growth, and food-related illnesses that damaged children across the economic spectrum, though the poor suffered most acutely. Let's start with the working class, where hunger was not occasional but endemic. A typical working-class family in Victorian England lived on a diet of bread, potatoes, and occasionally some bacon or salt pork, if money allowed. Fresh vegetables were expensive and considered suspicious anyway. Many Victorians believed that raw greens caused illness, so vegetables were either boiled into oblivion, losing most of their nutritional value, or simply avoided altogether. Fruit was a luxury most working-class children rarely tasted. Milk was often adulterated, watered down, and contaminated with bacteria, so parents who could avoid buying it did. Children in these families received smaller portions than adults because it was assumed they needed less food. A child might be given a piece of bread with some dripping, animal fat, for bread and maybe some thin soup for midday dinner, and more bread for supper. Protein was scarce. Calories were barely adequate to sustain life, let alone support growth and development. Malnutrition was so common that stunted growth was the norm in working-class neighborhoods. Children at age 12 might have the height and weight of a modern 7-year-old. Their bodies, deprived of essential nutrients during critical developmental periods, simply couldn't grow normally. Rickets, a bone disorder caused by vitamin D deficiency, was epidemic among working-class Victorian children. The disease caused bowed legs, deformed spines, and a host of other skeletal problems. It was so common in industrial cities, where smog blocked sunlight and children spent their days inside factories, that the distinctive bowed leg walk became associated with the urban poor. Other nutritional deficiency diseases were similarly prevalent. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, anemia from lack of iron, goiter from lack of iodine. These were diseases of deprivation, easily preventable with proper nutrition, but rampant in a society where children regularly went to bed hungry. And it's important to understand, this hunger was not inevitable. It was a product of economic systems that paid workers starvation wages, kept food prices high, and provided no social safety net. Parents were forced to make impossible choices. Feed all the children inadequately, or feed some children enough and let others go without. Use money for food or for fuel to keep from freezing. Many children worked specifically because their wages were necessary to buy food. creating a cruel cycle where malnutrition made them less able to work, while the need to work prevented them from getting adequate rest and food. Wealthy children, paradoxically, also suffered from food-related problems, though of a different sort. Victorian child-rearing philosophy among the upper classes held that children should not enjoy food too much. Pleasure in eating was seen as a dangerous tendency toward gluttony and self-indulgence. So children were deliberately fed bland, unappetizing food to keep them from developing what was called greedy behavior. Porridge without sugar or flavoring, plain boiled meat, unseasoned vegetables, stale bread, these were considered appropriate for children. If a child expressed enjoyment of food or asked for more, they were being selfish and needed correction. The nursery in a wealthy home might be well stocked, but the food sent up from the kitchen was intentionally made unpleasant. Cook would prepare delicious meals for the adults and then send plain, overcooked, or deliberately unpalatable versions to the children. The goal was to ensure children ate only because they were hungry, not because they enjoyed the taste. This was thought to build character and prevent moral decay. The result was children who dreaded mealtimes and who grew up with disordered relationships with food. Wealthy children were also subject to various food fads and theories promoted by doctors and child-rearing experts. At various points, red meat was considered too stimulating for children and was restricted. At other times, milk was considered the perfect food, and children were given almost nothing else, leading to nutritional imbalances. Sugar was viewed with deep suspicion, not because of modern concerns about obesity or dental health, but because sweetness was associated with pleasure, and pleasure was dangerous. A wealthy child might live in a house with a well-stocked pantry and still suffer from malnutrition because the prevailing theories dictated a restricted diet. Food was also used as punishment across all classes. Withholding meals from children who misbehaved was common and considered appropriate discipline. A child might be sent to bed without supper, which sounds almost quaint until you realize this might mean a child who'd already eaten minimally that day received nothing for 14 or 15 hours until breakfast the next morning. For a growing child, this level of food deprivation is harmful, affecting everything from energy levels to cognitive function to physical growth. Some children were forced to eat foods they found disgusting as punishment or character building. A child who gagged on liver might be forced to sit at the table until they finished it, even if it took hours, even if they vomited from the stress and disgust. The adult supervising this would feel virtuously that they were teaching the child not to be fussy. What they were actually teaching was that meal times were battles, and that the child's bodily responses and preferences were irrelevant. The lack of nutritional knowledge meant that well-meaning parents often made choices that harmed their children. Babies were given solid food far too early, leading to digestive problems. Toddlers were given meat and bread almost exclusively, with no fruits or vegetables, leading to constipation and vitamin deficiencies. Children were given tea, sometimes heavily caffeinated and with little nutritional value, instead of milk or water. In some working-class families, infants were given tea and bread from a very young age because it was cheaper than milk and filled their stomachs, even though it provided almost none of the nutrients a developing child needed. Contaminated food was another serious problem. Regulatory oversight of food safety was minimal or non-existent for much of the Victorian era. Milk was watered down, sometimes with contaminated water, and often contained bacteria that caused tuberculosis and other diseases. Bread might be adulterated with chalk or plaster to increase its weight and bulk. Meat might be spoiled and sold anyway, particularly in poor neighborhoods where people couldn't afford to be choosy. Children eating this contaminated food suffered from food poisoning, parasitic infections, and chronic digestive problems. Dental health was essentially non-existent. Sugar was expensive for the poor, so their teeth rotted from other causes, poor nutrition and lack of cleaning. The wealthy had more access to sugar, leading to rampant tooth decay in upper-class children. Dental care was primitive and painful, usually involving extraction without anesthesia rather than treatment. Many Victorian children had rotting, painful teeth by their early teens. This affected their ability to eat properly, contributing to further nutritional problems. Today, child nutrition is taken seriously by both parents and society. We understand the critical importance of adequate calories, protein, vitamins, and minerals during developmental years. Food insecurity is recognized as a serious form of neglect. In many developed countries, school lunch programs ensure that even poor children receive at least one nutritional meal a day. Food safety regulations protect children from contaminated food. And deliberately starving a child or providing grossly inadequate nutrition can result in criminal charges of abuse or neglect. The Victorian parent who fed their child nothing but bread and tea, who withheld meals as punishment, who forced their child to eat until vomiting, or who provided food so inadequate that the child developed rickets or scurvy, would face investigation and likely prosecution today. We've learned that food is not just fuel, but a critical component of healthy development, and that children have a right to adequate nutrition regardless of their family's economic circumstances. That represents a fundamental shift in how we view childhood and parental responsibility. Education, cruelty, and the shaping of minds. Victorian education, when it existed at all for working-class children, was a brutal affair that combined minimal actual learning with maximal physical punishment and psychological abuse. For wealthy children, education was more comprehensive, but no less psychologically damaging, emphasizing rote memorization, rigid conformity, and the suppression of creativity or independent thought. Across all classes, the Victorian educational system was designed to produce obedient workers and citizens, not educated thinkers. And the methods used to achieve this goal would violate numerous laws and ethical standards today. Working-class children who attended school at all, and many did not, went to charity schools, church-run institutions, or later in the era, board schools established after the 1870 Education Act. These schools were overcrowded, poorly funded, and staffed by teachers who were themselves often barely educated and certainly untrained in pedagogy or child development. A single teacher might be responsible for 60 or 80 students, ranging in age from 5 to 14, all in one room. Control was maintained through fear and force. The cane, as mentioned earlier, was ever present. But beyond physical punishment, these schools employed teaching methods that were almost designed to make learning difficult and unpleasant. Lessons consisted primarily of rote repetition. Children would chant multiplication tables, spelling words, or historical dates in unison for hours. There was no explanation of concepts, no effort to make learning engaging, no acknowledgement that children learn at different paces or in different ways. You memorized or you were beaten. Those were the options. Reading was taught through laborious letter by letter, word by word decoding with no context or meaning. Children might spend months learning to sound out words without ever being told what the words meant or why reading was useful. Writing was taught through endless copying of letters and sentences with harsh punishment for any mistake. A child whose handwriting was deemed poor might have their knuckles rapped with a ruler or be forced to write the same letter 500 times. Left-handed children, as previously mentioned, were forced to write with their right hands, the natural inclination literally beaten out of them. Mathematics education was similarly focused on memorization without understanding. Children learned algorithms for computation, but not the underlying concepts. They could perform the mechanical operations, but not apply mathematical thinking to real problems. And the problems they were given were often deliberately confusing or difficult, designed more to trip up students and provide opportunities for punishment than to actually teach mathematical reasoning. The curriculum was narrow and utilitarian. Working-class children learned just enough reading, writing, and arithmetic to be minimally functional in the labor force. There was no music, no art, no physical education, no science beyond the most basic facts. Literature was limited to moral tales designed to instill obedience and religious devotion. History was memorization of dates and monarchs without any analysis or context. Geography was memorization of place names and export commodities. And undergirding all of this was a constant message. You are inferior. You are ignorant. You are being educated not because you have potential, but because society requires minimally literate workers. Working-class children were reminded daily that they were not expected to achieve anything significant, that their role was to obey their betters, work hard, and not cause trouble. The educational system was not designed to lift them up, but to keep them in their place while giving them just enough skills to be exploitable. Wealthy children fared better in terms of educational content, but not necessarily in terms of methodology or psychological impact. Boys from wealthy families were typically sent to boarding schools, institutions famous for combining classical education with systematic bullying and abuse. These schools, the great public schools like Eton and Harrow, produced the future leaders of empire, but they did so through methods that traumatized generations of boys. Younger boys at these schools were essentially servants to older boys, a system called fagging. A young boy might be required to clean an older boy's shoes, prepare his meals, run errands, and generally serve at his beck and call. Refusal or inadequate service resulted in beatings, not from teachers, but from the older boys, with the full knowledge and approval of school authorities. This was considered character building, teaching hierarchy and obedience. Sexual abuse was rampant in these all-male boarding schools, though it was rarely acknowledged or discussed openly. Older boys preyed on younger ones, and the culture of the schools made it nearly impossible for victims to report abuse without being labeled weak or becoming even more targeted. Teachers and administrators knew this was happening, but largely turned a blind eye, considering it an unfortunate but inevitable aspect of all male institutions. The academic education at these elite schools was rigorous but narrow, focused heavily on Latin, Greek, classical literature, and mathematics. There was little practical education, nothing about science, economics, or modern languages. The goal was to produce gentlemen who could quote Cicero, not men who understood the modern world. And even this limited education was delivered through brutal memorization and harsh punishment for mistakes. Girls' education, even among the wealthy, was even more limited. Upper-class girls were typically educated at home by governesses who taught them accomplishments, music, drawing, a bit of French, perhaps some literature and history. But the education was deliberately kept superficial. Girls were not taught serious mathematics or science because these were considered unsuitable for the female mind. They were not taught anything that might prepare them for meaningful work because work was not their destiny. Marriage was, and their education focused on making them suitable wives and hostesses. Working-class girls who attended school at all received even less education than their brothers, as they were expected to leave school earlier to work in factories or as domestic servants. Female education was always secondary, considered less important than male education, because women's roles were seen as narrower and less demanding. The psychological damage of Victorian education is difficult to fully quantify, but we can identify some clear impacts. Children learned that learning was painful and to be dreaded. They learned that curiosity was dangerous and would be punished. They learned that questioning authority was unacceptable. They learned that their worth as individuals was tied entirely to their ability to conform and obey. The creative, curious, unique aspects of each child were systematically suppressed in favor of producing standardized products who fit into predetermined social roles. Today, educational law and practice have been transformed. Physical punishment of students is illegal in most developed countries. Teachers must be trained and certified. Class sizes are regulated. Curriculum standards emphasize not just rote learning, but critical thinking, creativity, problem-solving, and social-emotional development. Students with learning differences receive accommodations rather than beatings. Education is understood as a right, not a privilege. And schools are expected to nurture children, not simply break them into submission. A Victorian teacher who caned students multiple times daily, who forced a left-handed child to write with their right hand, who kept a child standing in a corner for 8 hours, who made a child write the same sentence 1,000 times, or who tolerated the systematic bullying and abuse that characterized boarding schools, would face immediate termination and likely criminal charges today. The Victorian educational system, with its brutality, narrowness, and fundamental disregard for children's well-being, would not survive first contact with modern child protection laws. And that's as it should be, because what passed for education in Victorian times was often just abuse with a blackboard. Safety, supervision, and accidents waiting to happen. Beyond the intentional cruelties of discipline, labor, and neglect, Victorian childhood was simply physically dangerous in ways that would horrify modern parents and regulatory agencies. Children lived in environments filled with hazards that would now be illegal, used products and toys that would now be banned, and operated without the supervision or safety equipment that modern society considers essential. The result was an accident rate that was accepted as normal, but which, in reality, represented systematic endangerment of children on a massive scale. Let's start with the home environment. Victorian houses, particularly those of the working class, were death traps by modern standards. Open fireplaces were the primary source of heating and cooking. There were no safety guards, no protective screens that would prevent a small child from falling or reaching into the flames. Children were regularly burned, sometimes fatally, when they fell into fires, when their clothing caught fire from getting too close, or when they knocked over pots of boiling water or hot coals. These accidents were common enough to be unremarkable. Stairs in Victorian homes were often steep and lacked railings or had railings spaced widely enough that a small child could slip through. Falls downstairs killed and injured countless children. Windows had no safety catches, no screens, no protections. Children fell from upper-story windows regularly, particularly in crowded tenement buildings where families lived in cramped quarters and children played near open windows for air and light. Household chemicals and poisons were stored without regard for child safety. Lye for making soap, various cleaning substances, lamp oil, medications, all were kept in containers that children could easily access. Poisoning, both accidental and sometimes through parents' negligence in using dangerous substances for medical purposes, was a significant cause of childhood injury and death. There was no concept of childproofing, no requirement to keep dangerous substances locked away or in child-resistant containers. The streets were no safer. Victorian cities were crowded with horse-drawn traffic moving at speeds that seem slow to us but were deadly to children. Horses kicked, carts ran over children who didn't move quickly enough. Carriages struck children playing in the streets. There were no traffic lights, no crosswalks, no stop signs, no speed limits, no requirement that drivers watch for pedestrians. A child darting into the street might be struck and killed, and the driver would likely face no consequences if the child was deemed to have been at fault for not watching. Street surfaces themselves were hazardous. Cobblestones were uneven, easy to trip on. Streets were covered in horse manure, making them slippery and unsanitary. Open sewers ran along many streets, particularly in poor neighborhoods. A child could easily fall into contaminated water and emerge sick with any number of diseases. Dead animals, refuse, broken glass, all littered Victorian streets, and children played among these hazards. For working-class children, the workplace was even more dangerous than the home or street. We've already discussed the horrors of mines and factories, but it's worth emphasizing the sheer scale of workplace injuries and deaths among children. Victorian factories were filled with unguarded machinery. Belts, gears, spinning wheels, all operating at speeds and with power sufficient to maim or kill. And children were expected to work around and sometimes directly with this machinery. Factory owners made no effort to make machinery safe. Safety guards cost money and slowed production. Child injuries were considered the cost of doing business, an acceptable loss rate. When a child lost a finger, a hand, or an arm to machinery, they might receive a small payment, or more often nothing, and they were typically fired because they could no longer perform their job. Disabled children had few options, often ending up begging on the streets or in workhouses. The chemicals used in various industries were largely unregulated. In match factories, as mentioned earlier, children worked with white phosphorus, which caused phossy jaw, a condition where the jawbone literally died and fell away, leaving the victim with a horrifying facial disfigurement before eventually killing them. In textile factories, cotton dust filled the air, causing respiratory diseases. In many industries, ventilation was poor or non-existent, and children worked in atmospheres that would be immediately flagged by modern occupational safety inspectors. The toys and products marketed to children were often dangerous. Toys were painted with lead-based paints. Children chewing on these toys ingested lead, causing developmental problems, cognitive impairment, and sometimes death. Dolls and toys contained small parts that posed choking hazards. Some toys were made with flammable materials and could easily catch fire. There was no regulatory oversight, no testing for safety, no standards that manufacturers had to meet. Children's clothing was often hazardous. Many fabrics used in Victorian children's clothing were highly flammable. A child standing too near a fire, as children constantly did in homes heated by open flames, could see their clothing ignite in seconds. The full skirts and multiple layers that girls wore were particularly dangerous, catching fire easily and burning rapidly. Many children died from clothing fires. Medical devices and patent medicines sold for children contained dangerous substances and made wild, unsubstantiated claims. We've already discussed opiate-based soothing syrups, but there were also teething necklaces that posed choking hazards. Various devices that were supposed to help with posture or breathing, but which actually constricted children, and countless other products that harmed the children they were supposed to help. Supervision of children was minimal, particularly in working-class families where parents were working long hours and older children were responsible for younger siblings. Very young children, toddlers and preschoolers, were left alone or in the care of siblings barely older than themselves. Accidents were inevitable. Children drowned in rivers and canals, fell from high places, were injured by animals, or simply wandered off and were never seen again. The upper classes, while they had more resources, were not necessarily more careful. Wealthy children were often left in the care of servants who had multiple duties and couldn't watch the children constantly. Gardens and estates had ponds, wells, stables full of large animals, all presenting hazards. Children were sometimes given ponies to ride with minimal supervision or instruction, resulting in falls and injuries. Today, child safety is a paramount concern enshrined in countless laws and regulations. Products marketed to children must meet strict safety standards, undergoing extensive testing before they can be sold. Toys are regulated for choking hazards, toxic materials, and sharp edges. Children's clothing must meet flammability standards. Homes must meet building codes that include requirements for railings, window guards in certain circumstances, and properly secured hazards. Workplaces are subject to occupational safety regulations, and child labor is heavily restricted and regulated. Parents who leave young children unsupervised in dangerous situations can be charged with neglect or reckless endangerment. Failure to child-proof a home where young children live can be grounds for intervention by Child Protective Services if it rises to the level of creating a substantial risk of harm. The Victorian parent who allowed a 5-year-old to play unsupervised near an open fire, who gave a baby a lead-painted toy, who sent a 7-year-old to work in a factory with unguarded machinery, would face criminal charges and loss of custody today. The transformation in our approach to child safety represents a fundamental shift in values. We now recognize that children, because of their developmental stage, cannot reliably protect themselves from hazards. Adults have a responsibility to create environments where children can play, learn, and grow without facing unreasonable risks of injury or death. The Victorian acceptance of high childhood accident rates as simply the cost of childhood was a form of collective neglect that we've learned to reject. Every safety regulation, every child-proofing product, every parental choice to supervise or protect represents the accumulated wisdom of learning from past tragedies. The Victorians paid for their lack of safety consciousness with the lives of countless children. We've learned those lessons, though the cost was terrible. Class, privilege, and different types of suffering. Throughout this exploration of Victorian parenting, the role of class has appeared repeatedly. But it's worth examining more directly how class shaped childhood experiences and created fundamentally different types of suffering. For rich and poor children, both of which would be considered unacceptable by modern standards, but which operated through different mechanisms. Working-class children suffered primarily from material deprivation and exploitation. They were hungry, cold, overworked, and physically abused in the service of economic survival. Their suffering was visceral and immediate, their childhoods consumed by the need to contribute to family income or simply to survive. But within their suffering, there was often a certain intimacy. Working-class families lived in close quarters. Parents and children slept in the same rooms, ate the same meals, however meager, shared the same struggles. The parent who sent a child to the factory at dawn did so with regret, knowing the hardship, but also knowing there was no choice. There was, in many working-class families, a solidarity of suffering. Upper-class children suffered primarily from emotional neglect and psychological pressure. They had material comfort, warm homes, adequate food, nice clothing, but they were isolated from their parents, raised by servants who were instructed to remain emotionally distant, subjected to rigid expectations and constant pressure to uphold family status. Their suffering was psychological rather than physical, though no less damaging for being invisible. The wealthy child who saw their parents once a day for a formal visit, who was punished for any emotional display, who was sent away to brutal boarding schools at age 7 or 8, experienced a deprivation of love and connection that scarred them deeply. Middle-class children often experienced a combination of both types of suffering, though usually in less extreme forms. Middle-class families might have some financial security, but still require children to work or contribute. They might have more parental involvement than upper-class children, but still maintain significant emotional distance. They often felt the pressure of trying to maintain or improve their social position, with children viewed as representatives of family status, whose behavior could elevate or damage the family's standing in the community. The physical punishment we discussed earlier operated differently across classes. Working-class children might be beaten harshly, but without the systematic, ritualized quality of upper-class punishment. A frustrated working-class parent might strike a child in anger, exhaustion, and desperation. An upper-class parent, by contrast, would never touch the child in anger. Instead, punishment would be coolly determined and delegated. The parent would inform the nanny or governess that the child was to receive punishment, and it would be administered with procedural precision. In some ways, this cold, calculated approach was more psychologically damaging than the hot anger of an exhausted working-class parent, though both forms of violence caused harm. Educational experiences, as discussed earlier, were wildly different. Working-class children received minimal education focused on creating obedient workers. Upper-class children received more education, but in the service of maintaining class privilege and conforming to rigid social roles. Neither group was educated to think critically, question authority, or develop their full human potential. Both were being shaped to fit into predetermined social positions. Health and medical care followed similar class patterns. Working-class children died from preventable diseases and malnutrition. Upper-class children died from medical interventions that were supposed to help them. Working-class children lacked access to doctors. Upper-class children had doctors who used treatments that often did more harm than good. The end result, tragically, was that children across the class spectrum suffered and died at rates that would be unthinkable today. The recognition of these class differences is important for understanding why reform was so difficult. Middle-class and upper-class reformers could see the obvious suffering of working-class children and advocate for factory reforms and education laws. But they had much more difficulty recognizing the psychological abuse in their own homes, the emotional neglect and rigid control that characterized upper-class child-rearing. It was easier to see the physical hunger of a factory child than the emotional hunger of a child in a grand house who never received a hug from their parents. Today, we recognize that children have certain fundamental rights regardless of their family's economic position. The right to adequate food, shelter, and medical care. The right to education, the right to be free from exploitation and abuse, the right to emotional connection and support. These rights are not dependent on class. A wealthy parent who emotionally neglects their child can face consequences, just as a poor parent who fails to provide adequate food can face consequences. The Victorian era's class-based approach to childhood, where different types of suffering were considered normal and acceptable depending on one's social position, has been replaced by a universal standard of care. We're not perfect at meeting this standard. Class still affects childhood outcomes in significant ways. But the principle has been established. All children deserve protection, care, and the opportunity to develop into healthy adults. The Victorian child, whether starving in a factory or emotionally starved in a nursery, would have advocates today who would recognize their suffering as unacceptable and work to remove them from harmful situations. That represents moral progress, even if the full implications of that progress are still being worked out. The slow march toward reform. The transformation from Victorian child-rearing practices to modern standards didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process driven by reformers, changing economic conditions, emerging scientific understanding, and, perhaps most importantly, the slowly growing recognition that children had value as individuals rather than as economic resources or blank slates to be inscribed with adult demands. The reform movements began in the mid-19th century, initially focused on the most obviously horrific practices. Lord Shaftesbury and other reformers campaigned for laws restricting child labor, arguing that children were being destroyed physically and morally by factory work. These arguments gained traction not purely from humanitarian concern, but from a mix of moral disgust, economic interests, adult workers wanted jobs that children were doing, and social control. Idle children might become criminals. The factory acts that resulted were incremental and often poorly enforced, but they established the principle that society had some interest in protecting children from exploitation. Education reform followed a similar trajectory. Charity schools and church schools existed throughout the Victorian era, but education wasn't compulsory until the 1870 Education Act in England. Even after this act, enforcement was inconsistent, and many children continued to work instead of attending school. But the principle had been established. Children deserve education, and society had a responsibility to provide it. Over subsequent decades, compulsory education laws were strengthened. The school leaving age was gradually raised, and curriculum standards improved. Medical reform took longer because it required not just legal changes, but scientific advances. The understanding of germ theory, the development of vaccines, improvements in sanitation, all contributed to dramatically reducing childhood mortality. But the specific horrors of Victorian medical practice, the opium for teething, the mercury-based medications, the dangerous patent medicines, continued well into the early 20th century. It wasn't until regulations on pharmaceutical products were introduced that the market in dangerous children's medicines was finally curtailed. The last and perhaps most difficult area of reform was around emotional treatment and discipline. Physical punishment remained legal and widely practiced long after child labor was restricted and medical practices improved. This was because corporal punishment was deeply embedded in religious and cultural beliefs about child rearing. It was only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries that countries began banning corporal punishment entirely, and this remains controversial in some places even today. The recognition of children's emotional needs and rights took even longer. The field of developmental psychology emerged in the early 20th century and began documenting how children actually develop, what they need emotionally, and how various parenting practices affect them. Attachment theory, developed in the mid-20th century, demonstrated the critical importance of secure emotional bonds between children and caregivers. These scientific findings gradually filtered into parenting advice, social work practice, and eventually law. But reform has never been smooth or universal. Backlash against child protection has been a constant theme. Whenever child labor laws were proposed, factory owners argued they would destroy industry. When corporal punishment restrictions were suggested, traditionalists argued they would produce a generation of undisciplined criminals. When child welfare agencies were given power to intervene in families, critics complained about government overreach. Every step forward in protecting children has been contested by those who benefit from the old systems or who genuinely believe that the old ways were better. And even today, reform is incomplete. Child abuse still happens. Children still suffer from neglect. Economic inequality still means some children grow up with advantages while others struggle with deprivation. We've established standards and principles for child protection that the Victorians would find unrecognizable. But we're still working on fully implementing those standards for all children everywhere. What we can say is this: the trajectory is clear. We've moved from viewing children as property to viewing them as individuals with rights. We've moved from accepting high childhood mortality as inevitable to seeing every child death as a potential tragedy to be prevented. We've moved from believing children need to be beaten into submission to understanding they need to be nurtured into development. The Victorian parent wouldn't recognize our approach to child rearing, and we're all better for it. Conclusion: looking back to see forward. So we've reached the end of our journey through Victorian childhood. And if you're still with me, if you've managed to drift off to thoughts of another time while learning just how harsh that time actually was, then perhaps there's something oddly soothing about the distance between then and now. We've covered the beatings, the labor, the medical horrors, the emotional coldness, the nutritional deprivation, the educational brutality, the constant danger, and the class divisions that made suffering universal but variable in its forms. Every practice we've examined, from caning children for minor infractions, to dosing babies with opium, to sending 5-year-olds into coal mines, was once considered normal, acceptable, even virtuous. The adults engaging in these practices were not, for the most part, monsters. They were people operating within the systems and belief structures of their time. But the practices themselves were monstrous. And recognizing that allows us to appreciate how far we've come. Today, Victorian parenting would be illegal, not in small ways, but comprehensively. Nearly every aspect of how Victorians raised children violates modern laws protecting children from abuse, neglect, exploitation, and endangerment. A Victorian parent transported to our time would face immediate investigation by Child Protective Services. Their children would likely be removed from their care. They would face criminal charges for child abuse, child labor law violations, child endangerment, and possibly manslaughter if their medical practices or neglect resulted in a child's death. But this isn't just about judging the past. It's about understanding the present and protecting the future. When we see how recently these horrific practices were normal, we're reminded that progress is not automatic or guaranteed. The protections children have today exist because people fought for them, because reformers documented abuses and demanded change, because lawmakers passed regulations and societies slowly, grudgingly accepted new standards. These protections could erode if we're not vigilant. There are still places in the world where children work in dangerous conditions, where corporal punishment is routine, where medical care is inadequate. Even in wealthy countries, children slip through the cracks, suffering abuse and neglect that goes undetected. The Victorian era reminds us that society can normalize horrific treatment of children, that good people can participate in systematic abuse if it's culturally sanctioned. Our job is to remain vigilant, to continue improving protections, and to recognize that what seems normal in our own time might be viewed as barbaric by future generations. We owe something to those Victorian children who suffered through those practices. We owe it to them to remember, to learn from their experiences, and to ensure that no child today experienced what they endured. Every child who grows up well-fed, safe from exploitation, educated, emotionally supported, and free from abuse represents a small victory over the Victorian legacy. Every law that protects children, every parent who chooses gentleness over harshness, every society that recognizes children as valuable individuals with rights, honors the memory of all those children who had no such protection. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can hold two thoughts together. First, gratitude that we live in a time when childhood is protected in ways the Victorians couldn't imagine. And second, determination to keep pushing forward, to keep improving, to never become complacent about children's welfare. Because the distance between us and the Victorians is not just temporal, but moral. And we have a responsibility to maintain and expand that distance. If these stories from the past have helped you find some peace tonight, if learning about these dark corners of history has paradoxically brought you calm, Then hit that like button and subscribe to join us on more journeys through the quiet archives of time. And if you'd like to support our work bringing these forgotten stories to light, your contribution means more than you know. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and whether these glimpses into Victorian childhood have changed how you think about the present. Until next time, sleep well, knowing that the world our children grow up in, for all its problems, is infinitely gentler than the one we've explored tonight. The Victorians built their world on the backs of children. We are still building ours, but at least we're trying to build it for children. And that's worth remembering as you drift off into dreams.